Today we're kicking off this unit on politics and the way that our political system works with a discussion of economics. And the reason that we do that is because there's such an important element of disagreement between the major political parties about economics themselves, what we should do, what the role of the government in the economy should be. And so we start today with a discussion of the difference between the public sector and the private sector. These are two elements of the economy. The private sector in our economy is much larger than the public sector. The private sector includes anything that is owned by either a person or an individual. Most people work in private sector jobs, and that means that most people are paid by the private sector. And one of the things that we're going to focus on is distinguishing between public and private. Churches. Even though lots of people go to church and go into the church buildings, and people are welcome in most churches, synagogues, mosques, these are private institutions because they're owned by the specific leaders of that church congregation. Maybe, it's either owned by the Catholic Church. If it's Catholic, it's owned by a smaller group. If it's a smaller church. But they're owned by somebody or by an organization, and that makes it private. Banks are private. They're for-profit corporations. And even though lots of people do business with banks, those are private transactions in between consumers and a private company. When people go to work, if you work in a factory, for example, or you work at McDonald's or Walmart, all of these are businesses, and you are working as a private citizen for that business, and they pay you your wages. Your wages are owned by you. That means that they are private. Those are your private wages. They're not publicly owned. Hotels are private. Malls are private. All of these, again, they're owned by a company or owned by a person. Even though lots of people go to the South Point Mall, all of the businesses in the South Point Mall are private companies. They're trying to earn a profit. And the mall itself is owned by a company that rents space to those businesses. So malls are private, even though the public generally is welcome to go there. One way you can tell the difference is that if it's a public place, then you have more freedoms to gather and associate there. For example, if you're at the South Point Mall and you want to do a protest, you can't do it without getting the permission of the owner of the mall. If the owner of the mall doesn't want you there protesting, they can kick you out. They can have the police arrest you for trespassing. If you're on public property, it's much harder to be arrested for something like protesting. If you're on the sidewalk outside of Hillside High School, a public school and public sidewalk, you won't be arrested for trespassing just for being there if you're doing something that is generally considered legal. Let's take a look at some public sector examples. The library is public sector. You can go in there, anybody can go into the public library and borrow books. But the library at Duke University is private because Duke is a private university. Even though wages and the salary that most people get at their job is private, things like WIC, food stamps, Social Security, Medicaid, and Medicare are all public sector. The military is part of the public sector. So you've got to be able to distinguish between whether something better fits in the private sector or the public sector. The eyeglasses that I'm wearing on my face, these are my eyeglasses. They are part of my personal private property. They were purchased from a private company that sold them to me. So there was a private sector transaction. My insurance is a private company, although it is paid for by my employer, which is a public school. So I'm a public employee. When the wages that the school pays me are part of the private sector because part of the public sector. So the money paid by schools to their employees, that's a public sector expenditure. But as soon as it gets to my bank account, it becomes part of the private sector. It's my personal money, and then I can go and spend it at a store, spend it at a restaurant, as I see fit. So those are some basic differences between the public sector and the private sector. Public sector is controlled by the government or owned by the government. That's very important. It might be the state government, the local government, or the national government. But public sector is controlled by the government, whereas the private sector is owned and controlled by individuals or companies.